needed charter schools. It needed an accountability system. It needed school performance scores. They also did away with, or made it easier for non-certified teachers to teach in schools. So it recategorized teacher certification and who needed to be certified. So all of this happened in the decade prior to Katrina. Then you get Katrina in August, and 3 months later, the state legislature meets in a special session, which is focused on recovery. They pass Act 35, which does a couple of things. First of all, Act 35 is just targeted at New Orleans, so this is not something that's passed statewide. And it redefined failing schools. So as anyone who's ever gotten a grade in anything can tell you, a D is not failing, right? A C is not failing. Technically speaking, right, C is supposed to be average. But as my students tell me all the time, right, C's are average grades, that's okay. With Act 35, for New Orleans only, the state redefined failing as anything at the average or lower. So all of the C, D, and F schools in New Orleans suddenly became failing schools overnight. That then allowed for the RSD to come in and take control of them. So the elected board then only controlled about 12 schools. The other 87, I think it was, went to the RSD. And so the state could control. So that way, local officials had no say over the vast majority of the public schools in New Orleans after Act 35. It also eliminated neighborhood boundaries. This was often posed as many of the changes, the post-Katrina changes, were posed as necessity. You hear a lot that charter schools, many schools move to become charter schools because they're more flexible, they're more nimble, and in the wake of a disaster, you can't wade through the red tape that central offices create, and you need to be able to do things quickly, and that's the reason for all the chartering. Same with neighborhood schools. The explanation here is often, well, people were coming back sporadically. They were coming back primarily to the areas that had the least flooding, and that's where the first schools were reopened, was in the drier neighborhoods. Of course, that makes sense. And so we need to do away with neighborhood zones because kids need to be able to go to school anywhere. Now, what the activists who were sort of the school reformers before there was school reformers, right? What they will tell you is that New Orleans always allowed students to go to schools outside of their neighborhood, that it was just a matter of sort of checking a box on a form, that it was very easy for students to go to schools outside of their neighborhood. They didn't have to do this. And the other thing to know about New Orleans is that it is a city that is characterized by its neighborhoods. Many people never leave the neighborhood they're born in. They live there, they live across the street from their mothers, their grandmothers, their aunts, their cousins. It is very much, you are not just from New Orleans, you are from the Upper Ninth Ward, or you are from the 7th Ward, or you're from Uptown or Lakeview. You are from the neighborhood. And not even, within that, there's, Pontchartrain Park and Gentilly and all of the various neighborhoods that if you've been there, you may have heard of. So eliminating the anchor institutions, which were schools for these neighborhoods, has had a tremendous impact on the culture of the city. They also, the OPSB, which Orleans Parish School Board, they were the employer of the vast majority of teachers prior to Act 35. After Act 35, the OPSB fired all of the teachers en masse because charter schools determine who's hired, right? It's not a central office that does that. And so, teachers then had to apply to individual charter schools. They could no longer apply to the district because that district really didn't exist anymore at this point. They did all of this through the exclusion of anyone who would oppose this plan. and especially Black teachers, Black administrators, school principals, other administrators, Black parents, and Black community advocates and activists. The elected board, which was predominantly Black as well, they shut those people out. Now again, the explanation here is often expediency, right? It wasn't intentional, it was just to get things back up and running. But there's a lot of evidence of secret meetings, a lot of evidence of people making deals before the official meetings took place. It was very much an intentional exclusion that took place to get all of this passed. So that everybody's on the same page, I think everybody understands what a charter school is, but before I go on, a charter school is sort of a public-private hybrid. It has some public features and it has some private features. Public features include its funding. So charter schools generally are funded through the same mechanism as traditional public schools, which is a combination of local property taxes, a state formula with some federal money, especially if it's a poor school. And it also, charter schools in I think every state, but certainly Louisiana, are subject to state laws around public meetings. So charter schools are required to notify the community of when they're going to have a meeting, what decisions, what the agenda is going to be. They're supposed to, maintain minutes. This is all part of being a public office for the largest public expenditure that any state really takes on as its education system. Privately, though, they're governed privately, right? The boards are selected by the charter operator, the board members. There are no elections for charter board members, and there's no way to hold them accountable, so that if you don't like the decisions that they're making, you can't really do anything about it. When someone leaves a charter board, the existing charter board members select their replacement. So it's very insular, and certainly not what we would think of as kind of a democratic way of governing. So as a political scientist, I came to this question mostly personally. I'd always been interested in education policy, took lots of classes as a grad student and even an undergrad in education policy. But in my early years, I was studying political behavior, voting, campaigns, political socialization, how kids develop their political attitudes, these kinds of things. And it wasn't until 2012 that I went to register my older child. I have 2 kids. Went to register in kindergarten, that I was sort of hit in the face with the public school system as it existed at that time, and discovered that despite all the advantages that I had, I was well educated, I had an internet connection, I had a private vehicle, which New Orleans is has one of the highest rates of residents that don't have access to a private car, and yet one of the worst public transportation systems in the country. I could read and understand things. I had a background in education policy. I also was employed by Tulane University, which had developed a partnership with a local school that, when I renegotiated, promised that any of my kids would be able to go to that school. Not true. So I became irate about the condition of the schools and the way you had to navigate this, because I just thought, how do people that don't have this whole set of advantages that I have, how do they do this? I had a flexible job. I could go to an open house at 10 in the morning on a random Thursday. I could drive out to the other side of town and go to a Saturday morning open house that was mandatory. If you missed it, your kid could not apply to go to school there. Right. I spoke English, right? So all of the forms were in my native language, and I didn't have any trouble there. There were all sorts of ways in which I had advantages, and yet at the end of that year, my child didn't get into a single public school that I applied to. And so I began to think about this as a political scientist, and think about, how does a wholesale change like this come about? how did we get here? How are people not storming City Hall with pitchforks? Like, I was ready to take on the whole city. And I was like, how are we just, not pushing back on this? Why, do people really support it? Because by 2012, there was a solid narrative in the city and nationally, because a lot of these reformers went on nationwide speaking tours talking about the great change that had taken place in New Orleans schools. And so I thought, maybe I'm just a minority, right? Maybe it's just me and everybody else loves this system. And so I began to study, and I was mostly focused on the governance issues. I'm not an education economist. I'm not an education psychologist, right? I leave that education policy stuff to the education experts. And I was interested in, how does this all work? And so here you see the change in the percentage of charter schools over this period. You can see prior to Katrina, 0.4, right? There were 3 charter schools in New Orleans prior to Katrina. By 2006, when kids go back in the fall of 2006, a majority of the schools were charter schools, public schools, right? So 57% within 1 year of Katrina are already charter schools. Most of these were pre-existing schools that became charter schools in that year. And then you see that it steadily rises, and by 2019, New Orleans became the first all-charter district in the nation. Today, there's 1 school that is run by the school board in a traditional way. It was started 2 years ago. I can talk about that if you're interested in Q&A. There's a lot of controversy around it. It's struggling right now. But all the other schools are charter schools. So one of the things I wanted to look at were the charter boards. There was almost no information about charter boards, who serves on them, what they do, how they think, all of these things. And I was really interested in these folks. So one of the things I look at is representation. When we talk about sort of small d democracy, right, we are concerned with a few things, and one of them is representation. How well does this group of people who are supposed to be representative, how well do they actually represent the population? And you can see, not very well, right? The city of New Orleans is a majority black city, and the school population is almost entirely, it's about 91% in 2016, non-white. Most of these are black students. There is a growing Latino population and a small Asian population, mostly Vietnamese, the children of immigrants that came in the 1970s. The elected board was majority black at the time. It has since changed a little, but charter boards were predominantly white and also predominantly white men. These were the folks that were most into the reforms, right? That competition was going to save us, school choice, accountability, that these were the things that were going to turn around the school district. So I also did an analysis of the degree of compliance. Because again, democratic theory would predict that if you remove accountability, right? So these folks were appointed, not elected. They could not be held accountable by voters in any way. And when you remove accountability, you also remove compliance. And that's what this shows. So meeting information. Now, most of the charter boards were complying, but you still had 25% of charter boards that never said what time their meetings were held. How are you supposed to go and ask a question and find out what's going on if you don't know what time or where the meeting's being held, right? In terms of who serves, state law only mandates that they post the names of those who serve with no other information, no contact information. And so it was really, really difficult to find a way to contact these people, to find anything about them. Required board documents and committee documents. The compliance rates really fall when you get into the committees. So finance committees, all of that's supposed to be public, right? The agenda's supposed to be public, the minutes are supposed to be public. And boards just didn't comply. And they didn't have to. There were no elections. The only way that they could be held accountable was through the charter authorization process. And the Orleans Parish School Board, which was the main operator, the state also authorizes a few schools, but the main operator was the Orleans Parish School Board and the Recovery School District. They never closed a school for noncompliance. They never threatened the school with closure for noncompliance. There really was no reason for them to comply. Occasionally, a local investigative newspaper would publish this kind of thing. And then they would all be like, oh, let me go and update my website. And then you would look 6 months later and it would be back out of date. So I also surveyed charter board members, and they were surprisingly honest about their opinions about their jobs, what they saw as their jobs, and how they viewed the public. I label this skepticism, but I think a better word is really disdain. They did not believe that the general public had the capacity to understand what was in the best interest for schools. They also didn't believe that they cared enough, that they just thought most people just don't care about the schools. And this demonstrated sort of their attitudes about the parents and the families, but also the teachers. There was a lot of blame on the teachers for the state of education, and a lot of distrust of teachers, especially Native New Orleanians and Black women that had been employed in the school district for many years. A lot of those women lost their jobs forever. They were never hired back in any charter school because of attitudes like this, that these same thoughts, these are about sort of parents and community members, but the same ideas are there about teachers as well. So, no, they could serve as long as they felt like serving, yeah. So a lot of my book is focused on sort of what happened, how we got here, how the system was maintained, and the governance process. But I borrow heavily from a theory called policy feedback theory. And most of us think about politics as giving us certain policies. So if we know the party of the legislature, we can predict what kinds of policies are going to come out of that legislature, right? If we know something about how politics works, whether it's local, state, federal, whatever, we can understand the policies that come out of that. This theory says that it's much more of a feedback loop, that the policies themselves also affect the politics. So particularly when you think about group behavior and the way that groups interact with systems. So one of the best examples of this, I think, from one of the best theorists of this idea, is about the GI Bill. So the GI Bill is passed after World War II, and it is wildly successful. Educates thousands and thousands of people after the war. And really, to be eligible for the GI, you just need to have served, right? It doesn't matter your income, your race. Well, later it becomes, at first it was race. But then, it's easy to become eligible. You just need to be a veteran. Not surprisingly, the people who get a college education through the GI Bill think really positively about that program. They're like, yeah, this program put me through college, made it possible for me to get a degree and to get a better job out in the workforce. Well, that feedback, then those folks think positively about the government more generally. The government is a benevolent institution, right? The government works for people like me. I do my part, the government does its part, it works really well. So they vote at high rates, they participate, they believe that their voice matters. That all feeds into this sort of positive feedback loop. If you think about a welfare program or Medicaid, which are heavily restrictive, right? Many states now have laws about drug testing or about workforce requirements. it's hard to become eligible for these kinds of programs. The documentation that you need to show is extensive. You can lose it very easily. That tends to show a really negative feedback loop, so that people then treat the government with suspicion. They don't think the government is a benevolent institution. They don't think it works for people like them. They don't participate, and that just becomes part of that feedback. They don't participate, politicians can ignore them, can stigmatize them, right? And it just sort of continues this loop. So that's the idea here. So my thinking was, I know my own experience was demoralizing and enraging, and I lost a lot of faith in the local government as a result of my experience, and I thought this has to be widespread, right? And so I expected there to be a negative feedback loop. And so that's the other part of my book. The second half of my book looks at the impact on the citizens of New Orleans, and particularly focused on the parents of school children, and their interaction with the system. So here you see, these are general ratings of the public schools over a long period of time. And I think the takeaway here is that attitudes don't shift very much. They're pretty stable. Going back to 1986, 35% of New Orleanians said that the schools were poor, right? A majority said poor or fair. You see that majority standing up through this entire period. Attitudes are slightly more negative right before Katrina, so the negativity increases a bit. Gets a little better after Katrina. There are fewer people in that poor and fair category, but still a majority of New Orleans residents are rating the schools as poor or fair after Katrina, and many years after Katrina, 2018, right? So this isn't just an effect of the initial change. I also suspected that there would be significant racial differences, given the divisions in the population in terms of the public education system, given what I saw with charter boards. I expected that Black families would have a very different experience in the public schools than white families. So here you see racial differences in the opinion about the progress on strengthening the public schools over many years, from 2006 to 2015. And across all of those years, what you see are Black New Orleanians are more negative about the progress on the schools than whites are. And that doesn't really change very much over time, those racial differences, and they are statistically significant. Here, this is a survey that I did of parents with school-age children. And again, you can see that the experience is very different depending on race. So Black parents both agree, Black and white parents want a high-quality school in their neighborhood. This is one of the common desires of people in New Orleans, but they also, there's sort of more of a desire for that among Black parents than white parents. This is partly because many of the schools are located in predominantly white neighborhoods, so there already are high-quality schools in their neighborhoods. But with the other questions, Black families were much less likely to say the enrollment process is fair. They were much more likely to say, if you know the right person, you can get your child into any school. They were much less confident that they made the right choices, and much less satisfied in their school placement than white families. You don't hear this narrative when you hear about the New Orleans miracle. This is largely papered over. But this is to be expected based on this idea of policy feedback, that Black families and Black parents have much more interaction with the public school system than white families do. So when you see a poll where a majority of New Orleanians say the schools are better now than they were before Katrina, you are seeing probably, most of these polls are polling registered voters, which is an even wider population. And a whole bunch of those people, the vast majority of those white folks, have never had a child in the public education system. So they're only hearing the narrative, and that's what is sort of being parroted back. These Black families are predominantly in the public education system, and they see it every single day. And so there is this kind of negative loop. I didn't find as much evidence of it as I had anticipated. I did a bunch of focus groups as well with families, and what I found there was that the negative feedback loop was not quite as bad as I thought, because the attitudes were so negative to start that there wasn't really anywhere for them to go down. That there was so little trust, so little faith in any kind of authority, school boards, mayors, city council people, state legislators. There was just absolutely no faith that these folks had their interests at heart, but this is particularly of Black parents, that there just wasn't any room for that to fall and become more negative. What I learned was that my reaction, my being enraged and demoralized, was really the reaction of someone who was very privileged, that I had had a great deal of trust. I thought I could do this. I thought, look at me, I have a PhD, I can navigate this, and that it was that sort of privilege that led me to be so demoralized by the system. But other people just anticipated, this system's not gonna work for me. I'm gonna have to fight against it. I'm gonna do the best I can for my child and hope everybody else does the best for their child. And I'm not gonna expect it to work very well for me. So what is it like now? Most of my research stops in about 2018, 2019. So how have things changed in the last 5 or so years? These are some recent headlines. This is the last couple of months in New Orleans. Orleans Parish School Board could close charter schools mid-contract under bill aimed at falling enrollment. I think this is probably an issue in this part of the country as well, falling enrollment. And so up to now, most of the schools that have been closed have been closed for performance. They haven't met the standards that the district has set, and so they've closed those schools. Now, the school board's going to have to start closing schools that are performing well, because they simply can't enroll enough students, because there just aren't as many students. Birth rates have been falling for decades, and there aren't as many kids. So they're just, from an economic sort of feasibility standpoint, we're gonna have to have fewer schools to serve fewer students. And so my suspicion is that the way those decisions are going to be made is not going to be kind of through open democratic processes and consensus building. That's not the history that we've seen in New Orleans. So we're just starting to see this. But if you can imagine being a parent and your child's going to a school, and then all of a sudden in the middle of the year, they say, we're gonna close the school. That's happened in New Orleans. And now, through this law, if passed by the state legislature, it would become more common. As Leah Chase School struggles, officials discuss next step. Leah Chase School is the one school that is run by the school board. It was set up 2 years ago, and in my opinion, was set up to fail. It was established after parents had already made their selections for the upcoming year, and then all of a sudden, a new school is allowed to be created. And so parents have already hey, I'm done. I've already picked my schools for next year. Why would they sort of go back? So then they, when the school opened, they're like, wow, we don't have very many students. Well, yeah. And so they've struggled with enrollment, and among other things. And we also have a school board that's not set up to run schools. It's set up to be a charter authorizer. It doesn't have the hiring protocols and staff. It doesn't have the support for teachers that you would normally see in a central office for schools, right? It doesn't have a lot of those supports. It doesn't have all of the things that you come to recognize in a school department. They're just not there. It's a skeletal staff, very few people, and their main job is authorizing and deauthorizing charter schools. And so the experience level also isn't there with actually running schools. Last here, we decided in executive session, this is a quote from a KIP board member. KIP is the largest charter network in New Orleans. They run 11 schools. And they recently decided in a private meeting, without putting it on their agenda in advance, which is a violation of state law, in executive session, another violation of state law, to close one of their well-performing high schools. And the board, the Orleans Parish School Board, learned of this and rubber stamped it anyway. So this school will be closed at the end of this year. Current students will be required to find another school somewhere in the city. And it was all decided without any public notification, without any public comment, and in the privacy of an executive session. So the same sort of shenanigans that we saw in the wake of Katrina are continuing to happen. These are some headlines here. So to sort of segue into what's kind of happening here and how this might resonate in some way, I understand you're dealing with school consolidation as well, and some issues around transparency and accountability. I think these are, there's going to be some really difficult choices for school boards across the country in coming years because the enrollment cliff that everyone's been talking about for most of my academic career is here. We are seeing fewer kids. And so how many schools do you need? How many schools can you feasibly run? Because we fund schools on a per pupil basis, right? So when you don't have very many kids in a school, you lose funding. And so that funding pays for teachers and buildings and lights and textbooks and computers and all the other things that we need to educate children. And so, I think schools everywhere are going to be dealing with this problem. And I think the best you can hope for is a transparent process that includes the community, opens up the process for people in the community who are most affected by these consolidations and closures to be able to communicate their preferences and ask questions. And where processes are run by people who can be held accountable by voters. We do not have that in New Orleans. And I would hope that you might have that here and in many other places where these discussions are likely to be held. So I'm going to close there. I've talked for too long. And I welcome your questions, your comments, your discussions about what's happening in this community. So thank you very much for your attention. I appreciate it.
Testing. Yes. Any questions from the audience? Comments?
I had two questions, but one was about school buses and whether those went away or how do families ferry their children all the way across town to these various charter schools when they have to work and all that. And then secondly, did unions go away? Was there a teachers union and how has that been affected?
Those are good questions. With transportation, it remains, I think, the thorniest issue for the school board. I was recently on a panel that students at Tulane put together, which had one of the elected school board members plus a CEO of a charter organization in town. And what I came away understanding was that we are in a different era now. Many things have been re-centralized since the early days. So in the early days with transportation, charter schools refused to coordinate with one another for transportation. And reportedly, the reason was that even though it cost them more money, they'd have to run their own buses all across town because there are no neighborhood zones to pick students up. The reason was they didn't want their students interacting with students from another charter school. And so that is largely still the case. That is, transportation is sort of the one of the main pieces that has not been re-centralized. Enrollment has been re-centralized. So when I applied to schools in 2012 for my daughter, I had to apply individually at every single school, which is how we could get to a situation where she didn't get into a school for kindergarten. Yeah, we chose a private school because we didn't have another option. And we were lucky that we had that option. If you don't have the resources for private school at that time, you just kind of showed up and hoped that a school would take your child. And now that enrollment process has been centralized, so there is one application now for all the schools. Schools do have a little bit of difference, so that some schools you still have to test into. But for the most part, enrollment is centralized. They've centralized discipline because there was a giant lawsuit that charter schools were expelling students that didn't perform well, and were expelling students that were costly to educate, like special education students. And so parents sued successfully, and there was a consent decree until this year that re-centralized discipline. So now there is a process at the board level for expulsions. A school cannot simply expel a student. They have to go to this board. But transportation is still one of these issues where schools run their own sets of buses. And it is costly, it is wasteful. And the kids get on the bus before the sun comes up. Yeah, they'll get on the bus sometimes at 6 o'clock and get dropped off at 6 p.m., and they're 5, right? So it's a big problem. With regard to unions, when the teachers were fired en masse, they had been unionized. The United Teachers of New Orleans, the UTNO, sued for many years. They lost that suit. And now there are maybe a half dozen charter schools that are unionized at the school level. But otherwise, there is no union presence for educators in New Orleans. So the teachers are just on their own in terms of advocating for pay, benefits, vacation, all of those things. There's really no advocacy group unless you're at one of those schools, and then at those schools it's limited the kinds of things that you can really organize for.
I saw a question over here. I also have a question online real quick, if that's okay, from our Zoom participants. Has anyone tracked the performance/enrollment of private schools during this time period?
Oh, that's a good question. Private schools are very popular in New Orleans. They were prior to Katrina. They continue to be. One of the claims that reformers made was that white families were going to start moving their kids out of private school and move them back to the public system, that the schools and the public system was going to be so good that families wouldn't want to spend the money. That has not happened. So in terms of enrollment is down, but that's because there are fewer children, it's down slightly vis-a-vis the public system, but overall the enrollment declines are pretty similar. And in terms of performance, private schools don't give you that information. They don't have to do testing, standardized testing, and when they do, they don't release the data. My daughter is in a private school now, and we can't even get averages for the students at that school. We get average test scores by grade for what's called independent schools, which is about 8 or 10 schools in town that are a mix of Episcopal schools, some secular schools, a couple of other schools, and we get averages. But we can't even get data for our own school, much less, and they would never publish, ever, the scores. Generally speaking, private schools' performance, there's a education scholar, Chris Lubienski, who has shown that private schools are actually worse in terms of performance than public schools writ large. That's not a New Orleans study, but that's a nationwide study. Americans tend to think that private equals better in all things, private healthcare, private doctors, private schools, all the private things, right? That you're going to get a better, higher quality of service in a private system rather than a public system. And the data, when we can get the data from the private sources, just generally doesn't hold that up. Right, yeah. Yes. Yes. And there's a psychological, I'm sorry. There's a psychological component as well, and I know we have some psychologists here, but as a parent, you are highly motivated to think that you've made the right choice, right? And so, yeah. So most people are going to say, yes, I love my kid's school. It's doing a great job. I think the teachers are wonderful. And you know, the reality of that, you know, may be different, but we are all, I mean, what unites all parents everywhere is we all want the best for our children. And we need to believe at some level that the choices that we're making are in their interest and are for the best. And so that also is a part of the difficulty of the public-private comparison as well. Because private parents only know private school and are motivated to say their kids are doing great. So, yes.
I was having trouble understanding how in the New Orleans school district that charter schools were the public schools. I was thinking as you were talking that the charter schools were private, especially you try to enroll your daughter in a charter school and was never accepted.
Yeah.
That
it's weird.
is very strange.
Yeah.
But just one little anecdote from my own teaching experience, first grade. I remember one year I had 5 kids out of the class who had gone to a pre-kindergarten together. Maybe it was church-sponsored, I can't remember. Pre-kindergarten, kindergarten, and then they came to first grade.
Yeah.
They had a pre-developed, predefined social group. They didn't mix with the other kids. Yeah. And I just have a public school bias because the world, you come in contact with all sorts of people. And when kids are being put in self-selected populations, they don't have contact with special needs. They don't have contact with a range of backgrounds and whatever.
Yeah, I totally agree. I saw it with my own daughter. She had attended private school through middle school and then a public school for high school. You know, and that freshman year, when she would come home, you know, she would be like, you know, this is just a completely different set of people than I'm used to. I mean, she loved it, and we loved it. Sorry, I keep doing that. You know, we loved it as well, but it was, you know, it took some getting used to. You know, she was like, you know, there are kids that lash out in class, and that doesn't happen so much, if at all, in private schools, because private schools can simply say, we can't serve you, right? You know, go to another school. Or, you know, the different economic backgrounds and racial backgrounds and religious backgrounds. You know, that's been really eye-opening for both of my kids, the different religious backgrounds, because in a private school, they both went to Episcopal school, so not a lot of diversity there. And, you know, there's, you know, public and private private schools have their advantages, and they can be better places for some students for sure. Just like charter schools, right? There are good charter schools in the country where kids are certainly better served. Certain kids are better served in certain schools. So I would not ever say all charter schools are bad, anything like that. I think it depends on the school, it depends on the system, it depends on the kid, and sort of what that school is kind of intended to do. But you know, one of the ironies in New Orleans is that especially in the early years, the rhetoric was very much school choice. Parents have choices, right? You can send your kids to this school or this school or this school. You have a lot of choice, where you were used to be locked into a neighborhood school. But there were no choices to put your child into a traditional public school. That was not an option. You had to choose a charter school. And then there was a lot of evidence, like what happened to my daughter, that the schools were doing a lot of the selecting rather than the parents doing the selecting, is that the schools were managing through their selectivity and their testing in and all of those kinds of things to select the students that they wanted to have.
It kind of turns school choice on its head.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
So I've got a question here, and then I have another one from Zoom.
You want to do the Zoom?
Okay, yeah, it's up to you.
So from Zoom, what are some signs at the state or local level that the communities can observe that indicate that the charter industry is beginning or has already begun to move in on the school system here?
Oh, that is a good question. Well, I think I say in the book, every community is one disaster away from something like this. It's not exactly true, but I think if your state has put in place the kinds of policies that were put in place in Louisiana, most states now have an accountability structure. After No Child Left Behind, this was mandated. So students are already testing too much, in my opinion, but they're testing a lot. Schools are already being scored and graded, you know, and so that kind of stuff is already in place. But if your state has an apparatus for the state to take over control from the local board, that's one sign. If it doesn't have that and that is proposed, I would say you would want to push back on that. These takeover districts are, they're everywhere. And they've been in, you know, New Jersey and Wisconsin and all over the country, where it empowers a state board to take control from the local board. So that would be one sign. I think as the percentage of charter schools vis-a-vis traditional schools increases, I think that's another sign. So, you know, in most places, charter schools are like one or two options in a traditional school district, which has the rest as traditional kind of neighborhood schools. But if you're starting to see more charter schools than traditional schools, or more students enrolling in charter schools than traditional schools, I think that is also kind of a warning sign that something like this could happen.
Got it. Hi, Dr. Lay.
Hi.
Thank you. I have a comment and then I have a question. So I had really grateful that we had the opportunity to talk earlier. And I just wanted to say that I appreciate you bringing up the GI Bill because your alma mater, University of Maryland College Park,
Yeah.
which I told you I lived in Maryland
Yeah.
for many years, created University of Maryland University College for those
Yeah.
veterans so that they could participate in the GI Bill, which is now University of Maryland University College, which is all over the world now. So
Yeah.
I appreciate you bringing up that analogy. So here's my question for you.
Okay.
And it is, I actually have very southern roots on my maternal side, and having visited the Deep South, specifically Mississippi, I learned years ago that the public schools were for students of color. The private schools were for white students, and that any white student who could not afford to go to a private school were given scholarships through the community.
Mhm.
Is there a parallel to that from in Louisiana?
Definitely historically. So in the 70s, when schools began to integrate, a neighboring parish, St. Bernard Parish, which we were talking about earlier, St. Bernard Parish offered to set up what they called segregation academies. And these were going to be private schools for white students from New Orleans that would be paid for by members of the community. Now, a lot of these have gone away, but the remnants remain. So, I think I said that about 3/4 of white families in New Orleans have their children in a private school. And that's a remnant of that. The white families that are in the public system in New Orleans are in about a half dozen schools. And in those schools, they are what we would have called back in the 80s a magnet school, where you test in. And sort of that's where almost all of the white families that are in the New Orleans public education system are in one of those schools, where there is some selectivity, where they've reintroduced neighborhood preferences, not boundaries, but preferences. So if you live in this neighborhood, you have a preference to go to this school. That tends to benefit white families. Testing in tends to benefit white, highly educated families. And so there are remnants of this for sure.
I have to preface that by saying that this information I received from my family in Mississippi was years ago. I'm hopeful that things in Mississippi are different.
I don't know a lot about Mississippi. I know a little bit about southern Mississippi and their
Neighboring states.
yeah. I would not be surprised if there are remnants there of the system as well.
We have a question here and then a couple more up there as well.
Full disclosure, I'm an unelected board member of our charter school. But in reference to the final comments you made about the schools closing and,
Right.
I would expect accountability in this state or in
Yeah.
where I am the governing council member. Is there there's no infrastructure or no, the level of accountability seems to be nil.
For the boards or for the schools themselves?
Is there no watchdog? And do people still, this is a system they want, so they're gonna
Yeah.
keep it, or?
So charter schools, what makes them a charter school is that the authorizing board, and across the country there are dozens of different arrangements for who's able to be a charter authorizer. In New Orleans, it is now predominantly the elected school board that is the charter authorizer. And they give a school a charter for a limited period of time. So 3 years, 5 years. I think the state recently changed its law to make 7 years the maximum, because it was 10, and I think they've reduced it. But at those periods, the schools then have to come back up for renewal. That's the opportunity for the school to be held accountable. And that's when most school closures take place, is at those reauthorizations or renewals, where the board says no, and it's generally because of the scores. There was one school closed for financial malfeasance, but everything else thus far has been, the schools that have been closed for low performance. There are a lot of issues with that, because what tends to matter is the performance in the year right before renewal, not sort of performance all the way along. So there's a big priority, and that sets up a lot of opportunities for cheating and corruption and a whole host of problems. But there is that set of accountability for the schools. Now for the boards, there's really no system of accountability for the. Right. They can complain to the board. The board could exercise authority and say, look, we're going to close you down if you don't start complying with these meetings laws, and then check it and have oversight over it. But they don't.
So charter schools are funded by the state and also federal funds. And we have seen kind of pretty dramatic swings in DEI policy over the years. I'm curious as to kind of the impact. You know, do you believe there was any progress? And now with the dramatic shift the other way, what do you anticipate seeing in terms of the way that these schools operate, given the restrictions on funding or non-restrictions on funding now related to DEI?
It's a good question. I think it will depend on, I'd have to give it a lot of thought, but off the top of my head, I think it depends on sort of what aspect of DEI you're talking about. So is it DEI in hiring? Because there has been a move, because in the early years right after Katrina, like I said, the black teachers that had been fired were largely not rehired, most of them. And there was a big infiltration of Teach for America and similar kinds of uncertified, kind of untrained teachers coming in that would only stay for a short period of time, right? That was by design. There has been a push in the last 5 years to prioritize hiring teachers who are going to stay, because it's just a constant churn where schools are just constantly rehiring people. And so I think in that sense, we have seen the numbers of black teachers increase over the last 5 years. And to the extent that that is a DEI policy, then we might see that be reversed. But the other side of it is that charter schools have a degree of freedom with regard to hiring, which can be both positive and negative. So they could be free not to hire teachers of color, or they could be free to kind of ignore what's happening in Washington and continue what they've been doing. If it's around curriculum, I think so much of that's set at the state level, and Louisiana, trying to think of a word that doesn't involve a curse word. I can't think of one, is a bad place when it comes to curriculum. I mean, you know, it's just, you know, it's run by people that don't want any sex education, they don't want any education broadly of American history, they don't want any education that would highlight an LGBTQ experience, right? And so that's at the state level and has really nothing to do with the charter system. And that has been a problem in New Orleans schools because, you know, New Orleans is, we like to say, a blue island in a red sea, right, politically. And a lot of the parents, teachers, kids, you know, are more liberal. And they want to have African American history in their schools, everybody, parents, teachers, administrators, everyone. And it's kind of the state that is saying, oh, we're not going to allow that anymore. Or, you know, they want to have, you know, clubs for students that identify as LGBTQ. And, you know, there's some pushback at the state level on a lot of that. But I don't know that that has as much to do with it being a charter school as just being in the state of Louisiana.
Thank you for being here.
Oh, thank you.
You mentioned Article 35, and I remember Article 35, and that's because I was offered a job so many times out of Article 35. Come to New Orleans, be a school psychologist, very few students, high pay. What psychologist doesn't love that? But I did not take that. I did not take it in. But my question to you is twofold. There are two questions I want to ask. First, the mayor.
First, I'm sorry?
The mayor.
The mayor.
Landry. Was it? His name was Landry.
Landrew.
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
He's a black mayor.
He was a white mayor.
He was a white mayor.
Yeah.
Okay. And the population was
Majority black.
majority black. but they did believe in the mayor.
He was well liked.
He was well liked, if I recall.
Yeah, he initially ran, first of all, his father was the last white mayor of New Orleans in the 70s.
Okay, all right.
And so the family is everywhere. Mary
Yes.
Landrieu was a senator from Louisiana for many years.
Yes.
And Phyllis Landrieu is, in politics. The whole, it's a family business, politics,
Okay,
right?
So given that you're
yeah.
a political scientist, my question to you is, what do you think is their legacy?
The
Given-
Landrieu legacy?
Yes, during that period, or even right, if you bring it up to Katrina right now,
Specifically around education or generally?
in terms of education.
Well, he and Mary Landrieu were certainly very pro-charter. She pushed a lot of the federal legislation with No Child Left Behind, and she was very much a reformer in that sense of standardized testing, school choice. These things were, she was very fond of that,
Okay.
as was he. I think it's unlikely that he'll have much of a legacy as mayor when it comes to education, because the mayor doesn't have much responsibility or authority when it comes to education in New Orleans.
Okay.
In some places, mayors can appoint board members. That's not the case in New Orleans. In some mayors, they control the whole system, right? Like they did in New York for a while, and DC had mayoral control for a while, and that's not the case in New Orleans. And so really, all he could really do was kind of champion ideas, but in terms of financing and real authority, the mayor really doesn't have a role to play when it comes to schools.
Okay, thank you. So my second question is the Army Corps of Engineers, because this is Katrina, you haven't mentioned the Army Corps of Engineers, but I have heard, and maybe you can correct me, that this kind of thing can happen again. Is that true? That can happen again, that the levies are kind of like iffy? Because people are like, these levies are iffy. Anything can happen anytime. Is that still the case, that
The word on the
hurricane can
street,
come in and do the same thing again?
the word on the street is no. Part of it is in the levees that were rebuilt, and that they were rebuilt differently. But another thing that has happened in New Orleans since Katrina is there are these gates. So New Orleans has a bunch of canals that run through the city as a way, because every drop of rain that falls in New Orleans either has to evaporate or be pumped out of the city because it's below sea level. So there's no sort of natural drainage that happens. And so these canals facilitate that drainage, and that's why they were built. That's generally speaking where the levees failed. And after the storm, we had a bunch of experts come over from Holland who know all about canals and levee systems and flood walls and flood protection, right? And they were like, you just invited the water into your city when you built these canals. Why did you do this? And so one of the things that's changed is they have installed floodgates that are closed when the water gets to a certain level, that theoretically should strengthen the levees on either side and prevent water from coming into the canals and then out into the city, which is what happened with Katrina. So we're told that if the same storm hit, it would not have the same effect. But at the same time, the eye of the storm did not hit New Orleans. So we have not had a direct hit by a Category 4 or 5 storm since Katrina. And that is one of those things where all bets are off, right? That there's really no city along a coast that is guaranteed to sustain in the face of a direct hit by a Category 5 storm. And we all know that living there. And the city sinks more and more every year.
So I think we have time for one more very quick comment. I saw your hand raised. Dr. Lay. Public schools, private governance. You can't have this copy, it's mine, it's signed to me, but you can buy your own. So I recommend
Where books
you
are
do.
sold.
Yes. Thank you so very
Oh,
much.
thank you.
Yeah.
I appreciate it. And thank you for coming. Thank you to the Zoom room.
Thanks to the Zoomers as well.
Yeah, thank you for the Zoomers and all of you for coming. I really appreciate your sort of rapt attention. I'm grateful to be here. So thank you. All right.
Thank you.